Welcome to this edition of the Personal Finance Playbook. I'm your host, Jack Wang of Longhorn Financial. Health insurance and medical expenses. Hopefully no one in your family gets sick, but when major illness strikes, even with health insurance, the cost can be substantial. In fact, uncovered medical expenses and related costs are a leading factor in bankruptcy filings in the United States. Yet, health insurance is something that no one really likes to pay for, but we all agree that we need it. For employees at a company, it's one thing. But for self-employed individuals and small business owners, it may be a lot more complicated. Here to discuss those options and share tips for those who are self-employed, small business owners, or simply those who work for companies who don't offer medical coverage, this is my good friend Tim Hirsch of Planston Distinct Business Solutions. Welcome to the show, Tim.
Thank you, Jack. Appreciate you having me on the show today.
Yeah, I'd love to have you on. So let's get right into it. So we talk about self-employed individuals and small business owners. They obviously have a lot more options because they're in charge of getting their own health insurance, especially the small business owners, right? So what are some options that small business owners and self-employed individuals, what options, I should say, do they have out there in the marketplace?
So when you use the word marketplace, that can be sometimes misleading because the marketplace generally is where people go to purchase health insurance. And in Massachusetts, it's the connector, but in most other states, it's healthcare.gov. And I'm not going to say they're not necessarily bad options, but they're options that are very specific to certain individuals who need certain medical services or have a certain budget. And it's not the end-all, be-all. And that's probably the most important part, especially for small business owners, is that they can go on there and get some sticker shock. That is not the last place they have options to look. There are other options available out there, and there's a lot of them. I mean, to start listing them off one by one, I mean, we'd probably run out of time here, but there's a lot out there, and that should be the most reassuring part for self-employed individuals and, you know, those smaller companies that aren't going to probably offer a group health insurance plan to a lot of employees.
Right, and you make a great point because I guess I have to be more careful about the terminology because marketplace actually means something now, right? Whereas years ago it may not have. So so that's one of the challenges with being self-employed or having small business owners. Like you don't have the size or the buying power of the large companies, right? But that's a challenge, right? Because group insurance generally is cheaper, correct?
It used to be a lot more. I won't say you're not going to find that the rates are going to be better. But what you do have in the group health insurance market is you have more companies and more plan offerings. So one very specific type of plan is a PPO plan, which allows you to go see a bigger network of doctors across state lines. And for individuals through the connector or on healthcare.gov, there simply are no options for PPO plans. But when you access the group health insurance market, you're going to have a better selection. But you're going to find that the rate typically isn't better. It's going to seem a little better to the employee, but that's simply because the employer is paying at least half of it. So when you actually break down the monthly cost of the plan, there's not much of a break.
Not much of a break. So that's interesting. I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions out there that, hey, if I'm self-employed, which I am, I'm going to pay a lot more, right? Or small business owner, I got a couple employees, I'm going to pay a lot more. In my case, fortunately, I'm covered on my wife's employer health insurance, right? Knock on wood. But it's a huge deal. So what are some options out there then for small business owners of self-employed? I mean, so we did talk a little bit about the marketplace, but you did mention some other options out there as well.
And there's definitely some alternatives. There's some plans through what are known as short-term medical plans. Now, those
which I think is a new thing that just came back, right? Under some changes in the law, if that's correct, or
so they never went away, but some of the rules around them changed, and it made it difficult because you had to renew it every 3 months. So most people feasibly didn't want to say, I don't want to reapply for health insurance every 3 months, and even sometimes they shortened how many times you could reapply, depending what state where you are in the country. Those options really are better for someone who's in between jobs who only needs a temporary plan of coverage. Now, what's really out there and readily available and is really starting over the last year or so become more in the public domain are through what are known as HealthShares. Now, HealthShares are very specifically not an insurance product offered not by an insurance company, but when you really break it down, it works just the same way as insurance does with some different language. There's no co-insurance, there's no deductible, because those are insurance terms. And this is an alternative to insurance, but it ends up being a good fit for a lot of small business owners, the one-man shops, the self-employed, because at the end of the day, if your goal is to lower your monthly costs and then lower your out-of-pocket exposure when you go to use your coverage, I mean, you're a win-win right there.
So I know we were talking a little bit about this off camera. Mm-hmm. Explain to our audience a little bit about HealthShares, because I know, because I don't specialize in this, whereas you do. Mm-hmm. It's a relatively new concept for me. So take a moment and perhaps talk a little about sort of the history, maybe how it started, and just generally how it works, and we'll get into some more details.
Yeah, it really is a great place to start. And one thing that's important to know about HealthShares is that they're nothing new. They've been around since the mid-'80s. They're simply becoming more known because health insurance has gotten so incredibly expensive. Not only on a monthly basis, but we always hear this, when someone goes to actually use their insurance, they can't afford their deductible. They're paying a lot on a monthly basis, then they have to pay $7,000 when they go to use it. So they've really become popular over the last probably 2 to 3 years. But the hard part with HealthShares is that they all work very differently. So it's hard to give a blanket answer to all of them. A lot of people are probably more recognizing recently as a lot of them are faith-based or for Christian health insurance, or I should say for Christian ministry health shares. These are done through companies like MediShare, Liberty HealthShare, and they've really had a big part of the market, but it's not how all health shares really function, because those ones are strictly you have to be Christian or you have to believe in a certain faith to be a member of it. Because instead of just paying an insurance company your monthly premium and they accept you, you actually have to join as a member. So the way I like to usually explain it is think of joining an association. There's a guideline to joining an association. You're looking for a certain type of person who's a common like-minded person within your association who's willing to join and become a member. These health shares work the same exact way. And the really neat part when it comes to the medical coverage is that these health shares are not bound to Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act regulations in how they need to offer their plans. So it becomes customizable in that HealthShare can actually dictate how the coverage will work. If there's any limitations or that initial sharing amount, which most people know is a deductible, how that's going to work. So what you end up with in the end is you end up with a much less expensive product that is more easily used and more customizable for the people who actually have it. And I think the best telling part of all this is when you actually meet somebody who's been on a HealthShare I've met people who've been on for 15 years with the same one. The longevity of someone staying on one once they become a member is incredible. Right. So it's really a good sign that these things are working. I mean, I always recommend for anyone to really look into the specific one. They all have a member guidelines of, hey, this is what we expect of our members and this is what type of community we are. Find the one that you're comfortable with, but don't blanket them all because you looked up one and it was certain it was this specific thing, because they're all a little bit different, and finding the one that works for you.
Now, I think when we had discussed before, I think some of the health shares originally started, you talked about being faith-based. Mm-hmm. My recollection was that perhaps they started to a certain extent like churches, sort of members helping members, right, things like that, and sort of expanded. But not everyone is faith-based, but you did talk about sort of being like-minded or certain things. So what are some of those guidelines that are not necessarily faith-based, but perhaps have other guidelines that members or associates or whatever you want to call them that would have to follow?
That's an excellent question. So if I could even take a step back from that, if we look at what the Affordable Care Act did and why health insurance became so expensive so quickly, is basically it said that health insurance plans all have to cover this wide variety of coverages. It's mandatory. Otherwise, you can't offer
Got to cover pre-existing conditions. And
pre-existing
like
conditions, but even substance abuse, which has become a huge thing around here, and it adds to why health insurance plans have gotten so expensive. When you get to the HealthShare world, they're going to not cover substance abuse treatment. They're going to say to their members, to become a member, you have to agree to not abuse drugs and alcohol. So that is not going to be a covered instance. And that ends up saving those types of plans a lot of money and having to pay out for these different types of claims. And it's why I don't like to knock the Affordable Care Act, because it's very important that some people can access those benefits or pre-existing conditions. If someone comes to me and tells me they have cancer, a HealthShare is not going to be a good fit. It's usually for more healthy individuals. But it might be expensive, but we have this health insurance plan that's going to cover everything you need within it. So when you actually get to the HealthShare world and these different companies, it's nothing overreaching for most people, although some of the real faith-based ones will have some specifics in there about contraception and being able to use that because that's what they are. But most of them are, you're going to agree not to abuse drugs and alcohol, and they're going to have some sort of limits on pre-existing conditions. So if you're a healthy person that's sitting there saying, I just need my coverage in case, that's usually the person that HealthShare is something you at least want to put on the table and explore. It may or may not be a good fit. Compare it against the other health insurance plans. But that's where you really start to see the savings. You can put the math to the problem and say, wow, if I'm going to save X amount of dollars, this is really starting to seem worth it. And the more I feel that people dive into it and actually research it and learn about it, the more likely they are to say like, aha, this is really practical for my situation.
And that certainly makes some sense. And you're right, health insurance, I mean, people talk about how expensive health insurance is, right? We tend to forget as employees, I know when I was in the corporate world, we tend to forget how much employers contribute to the monthly cost. All I remember thinking was, well, I'm paying a huge monthly cost to cover my family, but you're right, it has to cover everything soup to nuts. So in this case, it's not necessarily covered, but if you're, again, you know, we'll take substance abuse as an example. If you're not out there doing that, then this might be a more cost-effective alternative, right?
Yeah, you get to customize your plan to what you need in your family situation a lot more with a HealthShare. When with health insurance nowadays, here's the box, here's how all the plans fit. You take it or leave it. It is exactly how it works.
So now in health insurance, you know, there's things like co-pays and deductibles, annual maximums, you know, or limits and things, you know, things of that nature. Are there those equivalents on the HealthShare side?
That's exactly what there is. There's equivalents to it. So most of them will have similar, like your monthly premium that we all know that you pay to the insurance company to be insured. Most HealthShares are going to call that your monthly share amount. Works the exact same way. Deductible can be, I've seen it as member responsibility amount. I've seen it as initial share amount. So it can have some different ways of describing that exact same process though. I mean, the definition's going to be the same. The actual word's just going to be slightly different, but they have to use their own terminology. They legally can't use the insurance world, which I'm enamored with this a little bit because we've been so brainwashed in a way to use these words that we would use for no other reason in our lives, deductible and co-insurance, but that's all we know. So there is a learning curve to say to somebody, hey, we're going to have to use this verbiage, and they usually put that right in their member guidelines. I mean, these companies know where people are coming from and what their hurdles are going to be to get their minds wrapped around the concept, and that's definitely one of them, big one of them.
Right, but the concept's the same, that you make a monthly share amount or a monthly premium, right? So your monthly contribution, and there's some amount that you're responsible for initially, deductible, right? Member share, right? Whatever, right? The concept's still the same, right? But now, so here's the question. So, in insurance, let's suppose that that you end up having a major accident, right, due to a car accident, or your spouse is pregnant or something, right? Those are major, costly medical events. Now in a HealthShare, because everybody's a member, what happens when, God forbid, but everybody is in a car accident at the same time, or everybody has a kid at the same time, or has some other sort of major medical treatment? Doesn't that deplete the fund, if you will? How do HealthShares handle that, I suppose?
Well, I mean, like I said, they've been around for a long time. Never has a HealthShare gone out of business for finances. It's kind of amazing that when people just agree to live a healthy lifestyle and put the limits on pre-existing conditions, these small changes to it, that it doesn't really come up. They have reserves. I mean, these companies are not small. I do, in the near future, since the individual mandate's been taken away, my suspicion is that there's going to be a lot more of these health shares popping up. Right now, there's not a ton of them, and they're all big. There's enough pool of people that I have no concern. I mean, one of the major ones I work with is 1.5 million members, all contributing their monthly share. So 10 people get in an accident. But there also is one other mechanism involved in this, which is in the insurance world, it's called negotiating doctor's bills. In the health share world, it's more called being a cash patient. So all these health shares actually have a branch of their organization that helps negotiate and lower doctor's bills, especially for those really big claims or cancer treatment. And the power of being a cash patient when negotiating with a hospital, it's incredible to see how much some of these $700,000 inflated bills, that when the health share actually goes to pay it and all the fine print's taken out and the $1,000 robe, it ends up being like they paid out $70,000.
Wow, right.
So, I mean, I've seen that quite a few times in these, and that's definitely a huge element that helps, but it's having enough people, which that the health shares really do. They have enough people that if 10 people got really sick, it's not going to affect what they're doing because there's enough money, there's enough pool of money coming in, and they've been doing it for 20 years, so there's a huge reserve sitting there, just like an insurance company would have. Difference, it's not regulated by our Department of Insurance and the Affordable Care Act.
So, so that's kind of, again, it's very similar in concept, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, because monthly premium, everybody's chipping in, and the insurance company, of course, is reserving, right? And out of 1 million people, you would not expect all 1 million people to get in a car accident all in one day. Hopefully not, obviously, right? I mean, theoretically possible, probably not so possible. But one of the issues around health insurance, of course, and I know I ran into this because years ago I ended up buying some insurance on the marketplace for a short time, are the things, the so-called networks, right? And so, of course, one of the ways to avoid charges or avoid extra charges is always make sure you go see someone in network. But you can't always help that. But that's an insurance thing. Does that apply to the health share world?
Actually, I'm glad you mentioned this because I would have been mad at myself if I didn't think of speaking on this. So probably one of the top 3 bullet points to what a health share is able to provide. And I work in a lot of different states throughout the country. One of the biggest problems that people are finding now is that plans are HMOs, in-state networks only. And I work in a market in Las Vegas, Nevada, where it's not huge, but the doctors out there are not the best in some areas. So people want to go to UCLA or different facilities out of state. They're paying out of pocket if they need to go get a second opinion from maybe there's one doctor in the whole valley that actually does that, and maybe you're not comfortable with them. So that's a huge issue right now where health insurance didn't really project that was going to be such a problem. So if you take a step back into the health share world, these plans are everything that our politicians talk about all the time. Sell across state lines, networks to go see any doctor. I mean, some will have big PPO networks, but generally speaking, if you're in Wyoming or you're in New Hampshire or you're in Massachusetts, you're paying the same price and you have the same access to any hospital or doctors that you want across the country. Versus if you go to New Hampshire, we're in Massachusetts, the rules and regulations on how those plans are going to be completely different.
Right.
So it's really refreshing, and it makes it, the concept of explaining a health share to people can, be a little tough for people to wrap their minds around sometimes, but that's the easy part. It's the same. I don't care where you are. I don't care what your zip code is. it's the same coverage, same plan, same price, and go see whoever you want for your doctors or hospital.
Right, and you talked about how we've sort of been brainwashed, if you will, with using insurance terms, right? And I know for myself, going to see another doctor, or if I want a second opinion from a specialist, right? First thing I check, are they in network, right? I mean, number one, right? Number one, right? But that doesn't matter here. So with HealthShares, I mean, it sounds, to a certain extent, it sounds, in some ways, almost like too good to be true, right? And you said that they've been around a long time. So if I'm a small business owner and I have employees, what are some of the things I maybe want to pay attention to as I'm comparing, let's say, a traditional health insurance plan to something like a HealthShare? What are some of the things I want to watch out for?
I don't want to say watch out for, but when it comes to healthcare in general, there's really two big elements that I try to speak to people about that I think starts to click. One is the network, which we just talked about. All right, we're already over that hurdle. That one's actually very easy. The next one's how much you want to spend on your healthcare. It's a dollars and cents question. It's how much do you want to spend, and then if I need to use my coverage, how much is this going to cost me to use my coverage? So it's very easy to illustrate that because you know what you're going to pay on a monthly basis. You know what your potential out-of-pocket is either way that you go. So when you really start to just put math to it, which one do you want to do? If you're, and I run into it, I'm just more comfortable with sticking with insurance, then that's fine. You're going to pay that higher amount, and that's, the fact of the matter. The other one is just pre-existing conditions. HealthShares are not for everyone. You got to be really careful if you've had cancer in the past and they're going to, limit your coverage on your pre-existing cancer, because that could be a big deal that you might need to pay for that insurance plan. But it's more for people that I've noticed that they got to get their mind wrapped around a HealthShare. And I don't usually sit there, and a show like this is very helpful, which I'm still baffled how we don't see this more in the news. You're starting to see it a little more creep in there, but it kind of baffles me that's not more public knowledge for whatever reason. But I usually send them the information. It's very easy to look up on Google nowadays and figure out the pros and cons, look at reviews, see what's going on. There's always some negative about anything, but there's a ton of positive out there, and use other people's stories, use other people's situations. I belonged to one for a couple of years. I share my stories that when my family's had to use it and how it's worked and how it differs, and usually it makes a lot of sense.
And you bring up, so if I'm a small business owner, and you brought up the notion of pre-existing conditions. So if I have a couple of employees, depending on what their personal circumstances might be, I might be forced to go health insurance because they might have some pre-existing conditions. But if they don't, or if I'm just dealing with as a self-employed, right, just myself, I know if I have a pre-existing condition, right, then I may be a little bit freer to choose. So do you find that this HealthShares tend to work better in the self-employed market, or do you find that you also get a lot of traction in the small business, handful of employees up to however many, where do you see it fitting a little bit better?
All right, so you're getting a little bit of a technical question. Definitely here. But it's, it's an element of, if say a business has 10 employees, that employer is probably not going to sit there and go look online and figure out their health insurance by themselves. They're probably going to have someone like myself come in, sit down with them, weigh the pros and cons. It's really not that difficult for that one-off with an employee or two employees that a HealthShare is not a good fit for that employer to figure out another option for them. Because we always have healthcare.gov in the connector.
Right.
So those individuals can always go and figure out what they might need for their family. And if that employer has to compensate them differently, it doesn't become that hard of a situation. Especially when you're looking at saving a large amount of money, it usually becomes, all right, just how do we do this? That's fine.
Right.
And it's all, how that company is going to communicate it with their employees. But at the end of the day, it's no harder or less hard than putting in a group health insurance plan, because those have their issues and caveats too.
Right. And that's exactly right. I think back in the day, pre-Affordable Care Act, health insurance plans, again, I didn't do it, but just what it reads, could, carve out because of pre-existing conditions. So to your point, if you have 10 employees, 9 of them qualify, 1 doesn't, and you're saving a ton of money on the 9, you'll eat a little extra cost on the one.
Yeah.
Right. It's the math still works out,
It
like
does.
you said.
It all comes down to math with healthcare. It really does. What's the cost? What's this mean to me over the long term?
All right. So, so we did talk a little about sort of the situations where it may not necessarily fit. We talked about, things like alcohol and drug abuse, or pre-existing conditions. In your experience, have you seen other common sort of disqualifiers? For example, like smoking. Is smoking a disqualifier for some of these?
It definitely can be. That's actually a really good one. So most of them, if you're a tobacco user, you're not going to be able to be part of a member. Now, there are some that are specific to employers that there's just a surcharge on there, but that's great for your small business owner, your mom and pop shops. So it does limit the amount that you're eligible for.
Yeah.
But again, I can't argue with the HealthShare for doing that, because that's going to help everyone else costs.
Well, right. If you do that, you are at greater risk, greater potential health costs and stuff. So that makes sense.
But it's up to them, which is the nice part. It's up to the HealthShare to decide, their members to decide if that's what they want or if that's what they don't want.
So each employer could customize this to a degree, right? To a little bit of a degree. Okay. All right. So time for one last question. And this has been great because I think you're right. There's not a lot of news out there. And I think when you and I first sat down, I think I just read an article about this in some business magazine, but it was the first one I'd ever seen about it, so I really had not heard about it. But in the short time that we have left, so what's one final tip for our audience who may be considering something like this or looking at something like this because maybe they're self-employed or a small business owner? What would that be?
It's such a big financial decision. I'm always worried or concerned for people who just say, you know what, I'm just going to do what I've always done, and I'm not going to spend the time to really wrap my brain around this, because when you're looking at saving $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, and for a bigger family, a lot more on an annual basis, quantify that to how much that money could mean to you in your pocket, and then say, all right, now I'm willing to spend this time, because the more people are willing to dig in and learn about it, if it is a fit and you are in that, realm of this does work for me and my family or my situation, you're going to save a ton of money. And why not save a ton of money if that's in the best interest of your family? But it's just dig in, learn about it, communicate with someone who actually helps people with these plans like me, because I always do the same thing for my clients. Here's the information, here's how you can research it, come back with your questions, because there's always going to be a few questions you weren't able to get answered, but I'm a resource to them to give them direct answers to what they still have before they can make a final decision.
Right. Excellent. Thank you so much. I want to say thank you again to my special guest today, Tim Hirsch of Planston Distinct Business Solutions, talking about this great alternative that may apply to small business owners and self-employed individuals. In the news, you hear a lot about healthcare costs, how expensive insurance is, how severe some of these costs are. And so here's an option that may, again, the key operative word, may be of benefit to certain individuals, certain self-employed or what have you. Again, big thanks again to my special guest, Tim Hirsch, and stay tuned next time when we tackle another topic from the Personal Finance Playbook.